So as many of you will know already, the Anglo-Saxons gained political control over a swathe of Britain, most of it in fact, and defined the culture and language, particularly that of the area that would become England later on. However, the nature and the extent of their settlement is still debated today. The question of whether it was peaceful or bloody is always going to be one of degrees, and this is one of the main questions that people debate about. But it's always going to be one of degrees because, as we know, even before the departure of the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons were raiding into Britain. But because of the way that they redefined the culture of England particularly, people wonder as to how much they eradicated the population that came before, and how they managed to subjugate so many people if they didn't do that. Part of the reason that these questions exist in the first place is that we have such few written sources. This is why we used to call this time period the Dark Ages. There's so few written sources in this period, and it's very hard to trust them because they're not sort of written in the same discipline of history that exists in modern times, where you're actually trying to be accurate. People sort of deliberately will be biased, and they're always being commissioned to write something by a certain king, some kind of authority. Intellectualism isn't like a free market, so to speak. Perhaps that's not the best way of describing it, but they tend to be biased to the authority that they're writing under the jurisdiction of, shall we say. And they sort of, there's different ways that you could look at writing history, but particularly in the early days, and when you're not necessarily thinking about how your work is going to be received a long time later in history, it's easy to just look at it from the point of view of like, what is pragmatically useful for me to write about, rather than what actually happened, because, historians will be like that even now, trying to rebrand things, because they're worried that other historians are branding it in another way too much, I always tend to probably defend the British Empire more than I would normally in whatever given scenario, because it's so trendy at the minute for people to try and characterize it as evil, and they tend to use modern standards of morality which were sort of developed during the British Empire, and you could say are a result of the British Empire, of that period of history, to judge it. So I'm kind of saying, so I'll push back on that. And you can see how, before the proper discipline of being a historian developed, this is kind of what people were doing. They were just trying to write something that was useful. And also, aside from me sort of wanking off about, the discipline of history, what sources did they have to work with? You know what I mean? It was pretty hard for them to research what they're writing about. It's all just loads of monks talking to each other, basically. And they don't really get out much. And so, it's hard for them to even write something accurate, even if they're trying to. There's so many practical problems with what they're trying to do anyway, besides this idea of the discipline of history. But anyway, one of the biggest sources that people use are the writings of Gildas. It's shaped a lot of the current perception of this period, and this is one of the few primary sources that are written somewhat near the time that this happened. Now, Gildas writes The Ruin of Britain, and he describes in it how a proud tyrant, who's known as Vortigern, foolhardily bribed the heathen forces of the brothers Hengist and Horsa to deal with the Picts. So he bribed these people to use them as mercenaries, come over and fight against the Picts, who were sort of bullying the Romano-British at the time. And he was soon betrayed by them, and the Britons, they lost lands to the martial prowess of these ex-mercenaries who become invaders. And Gildas describes them as savage animals, devils, and sometimes brutal heathens. These events were retold similarly by later writers, including Bede, who's a famous sort of monk writer, and Nennius. We are painted a picture of a long, violent struggle in which the Anglo-Saxons plundered and devastated the land and gradually wrested control of the land from the Brythonic people, which is another word that people use to describe these sort of the population of sub-Roman Britain, which is quite a sort of a loaded word because it's talking about how, like, sub-Roman implies that it's got much worse after the Romans left, but I think that's probably true, that it had gone downhill a bit. So I kind of like the term sub-Roman Britain. Gildas includes biblical levels of destruction and slaughter in the text, exclaiming that all the major towns were laid low, and to all the inhabitants, church leaders, priests, and people alike. However, this narrative has been put into question. Such is warranted because this period, as we know, it's known as the Dark Ages. There's so few sources around, and it's characterized by mysteries and perplexions, which we haven't fully illuminated. But the saving grace of this is that it's always good to revisit it, because science is always expanding the clarity that we can look at the period with other means. So we can use archaeology and genetics, which is always getting more and more effective. And these kind of dark periods, in inverted commas, is where we want to use these things the most. Very little is known about the background of Gildas, and what is known is hotly debated. He writes in a kind of inflated rhetorical style, trying to be as provocative as possible, ostensibly in order to advise and aid the ruling class of the Brythonic peoples. And also, as he says, to prosecute with tearful complaint the mistakes of the past as he recounts them. So the writings of Gildas are heavily seasoned by his station and education as a monk. The way he sees reality is very sort of religiously ordered, and you can see that in his the way he describes various groups. Gildas recounts the initial period of war in which the Brythonic tribes won some successes against the Anglo-Saxons by framing it as a test from God, and says that the successes were explained by the fact that some of the Britons had reconciled themselves with God. And he also dehumanises the Anglo-Saxons because they're pagans at this point. It's clear that the worldview that he portrays is greatly influenced by his religious beliefs, obviously, and he's acting on his responsibility of his station as a monk. You know, this is one of the things that colours the historiography of this period. So as well as having to take it with a pinch of salt because of this religious kind of ordering of it, we don't know how much his sort of rebranding to fit it into a certain religious struggle, because, like I said, he has a responsibility as a monk that he's trying to fulfill. In addition to that, it's been found that the existence of these 5 kings that he brings up, and he sort of criticises, these are the people that he's prosecuting with tearful complaint in the second part of his text, are not backed up by date or identity by the Annales Cambriae or by Welsh genealogies. These are some other contemporary sources, which suggests that there's inaccuracy here. You know, is he just spinning some kind of Aesop's fable with this and trying to sort of use it as like a manifesto for how they should move on, you know? So here's where I try and go into some other things that we could use to work out what happened and compare them to what Gildas says and what the general impression that we get from the literature. So the first thing to recognise is that there are factors besides Anglo-Saxon violence that brought about the fall of the Brythonic tribes. The plague of Justinian, which you may have heard of, which actually prevented a reconquista of the Western Roman Empire by the Byzantines, because it decimated the population of the Eastern Mediterranean, the part that the Byzantines still had, also claimed many lives in the British Isles, with estimates of 1/3 of the population of Ireland affected. Potato famine number 1, perhaps, there. The connections that were established when Britain was part of the Roman world helped to spread the disease. Conversely, the native lands of the Anglo-Saxons, which were North Germany and, some of Scandinavia, people think some of the groups came from, were outside its influence, obviously, because the Romans never conquered the whole of Germany, certainly didn't conquer any of Scandinavia. So they were not demographically damaged by this plague. Archeological evidence of abandoned Roman towns could support this theory. There's also some shallow graves of large amounts of skeletons, and including a lot of children, in a cemetery that people reckon was buried around this period, so it could point towards this kind of devastation as well. And I mean, if Ireland was devastated to that extent, then you would assume that Britain was hit pretty flippin' hard as well, particularly in the more urban areas of England where the Romans had settled most thoroughly. Gildas himself also mentions a demographic decline, remarking that the cities in Britain's land are not as populated as they once were, and were deserted at the time of his writing. He also writes of widespread devastation by the Picts and Scots before the coming of the Saxons, retelling a request for military aid from the Britons to the Romans, which claims that Picts and Scots pushed them into the sea. And between these two kinds of death, we are either drowned or slaughtered. This would perhaps reduce the amount of potential violence involved in an Anglo-Saxon settlement, which simply replaced the previous power structure of a weakened society. Recent genetic evidence supplies today's historian details previously unknown and unknowable. Studies have found that the ethnic English Y chromosome, which is passed down unchanged by males through reproduction, is strikingly similar to that of Germanic ethnic groups, such as the modern-day ethnic Frisians, who share a very similar language to English as well, and are likely sort of descended from the people that came over, at a rate of 50 to 100% prevalence in England. So this English Y chromosome is related to the ethnic Frisians at a rate of 50 to 100% prevalence, is how often you find it. Additionally, Y chromosomes in historically Celtic North Wales were strikingly dissimilar to English ones, suggesting that it's not a Celtic Y chromosome, it is in fact a Germanic one, as it's suggested by it being similar to the Frisian one. In case you didn't get what I mean. The pattern of the distribution of the Y chromosome, which ranges from 50% to 100% prevalence in England, is consistent with the areas of most and least Anglo-Saxon settlement. So basically, more in the east and south, right? Confirming that this is probably an Anglo-Saxon addition. It is hard to explain this without some form of subjugation of the native Britons. How would the native male population be prevented from breeding or consistently be outcompeted in breeding in such wide areas enough to phase out their Y chromosome in the general population without any kind of, subjugation or lower status given to them? Guys don't tend to just let that happen. Ominously, this could also be interpreted to point to a dramatic reduction in the number of native males, if you know what I'm saying, through bitter and prolonged warfare or just mass extermination. So although Gildas describes wholesale slaughter of, the Anglo-Saxons killing everyone, I suppose you could say Gildas still kind of supports this idea, because you would still assume that more men are going to die, realistically, aren't they? You're going to keep some women alive for rape. So I guess this is backing up Gildas to a certain extent. However, the archaeological evidence for genocide in this period is lacking. Although enough migration to eclipse the approximately 2 million strong Romano-Celtic, the Romans, they don't seem to think that the Romans left a genetic legacy in Britain, so it's not necessarily a Romano-Celtic population. Let's just call it the Brythonic population. Seems doubtful in this time period, especially by sea. It's much harder to migrate a huge amount of people by sea, especially in this time period. Biologists of the study referenced earlier calculated that it would require over 500,000 migrants to create the genetic results found, which is far over the amount of other migrations in this period. In comparison, the Ostrogoth migration to Italy was only estimated at 100,000, and this was over land. I don't think it's reasonable to assume that the Anglo-Saxons could manage to do 500,000 over sea in these, relatively small boats that they had. Now, there's a pretty spicy study by Mark G. Thomas, Michael P. H. Stumpf, and Henrich Harker, which suggested that there was a form of sexual apartheid. I think that's the title of the study, like sexual apartheid in Anglo-Saxon Britain. And they've suggested this is an explanation. So they're basically saying that special laws restricted the breeding of Brythonic males by, demoting them, taking away their rights, allowing the genes of the settling population to take over in sort of like a eugenic crusade. And weirdly enough, there is some kind of precedent in Anglo-Saxon law for this, because the law of King Ine of Wessex, which is a guy that ruled Wessex, a fair while after the actual invasion, he states that the Ware Guild, I'm not sure if Ware Guild would be a better pronunciation for this because it's Old English, more similar to German. The Ware Guild is like a price that you have to pay that was introduced as an alternative to the blood feud, where the families of people who got in a fight and killed each other would take revenge on each other, and it would just end up in a cycle of violence. You still get this in some parts of the world today. The Ware Guild was a way of intervening in that, so that instead of having to get bloody revenge, you would just pay a certain amount to the family of the victim. And there was a Ware Guild for each sort of body part, each sort of level of maiming, and also you had to pay more the higher status that the person was. So if someone's Ware Guild is less, that means that they are more common, they are more like lower class. And if you sort of accidentally kill a noble, then you're just absolutely screwed, because the Ware Guild is going to be so high that you won't be able to pay it. And if you can't pay it, then you become a slave. So anyway, King Ine of Wessex, in his law it states that the Ware Guild for the death of a Briton was between 2 and 5 times less than that of an Anglo-Saxon. So you could say that that points to some level of apartheid. This law was written centuries after the initial Anglo-Saxon migrations, showing that there was an enduring divide in classification between the two peoples, an enduring difference in class. This also demonstrates a lower class attributed to the Britons, as I've already said, which hardly paints the image of a peaceful settlement, as it is doubtful that each Briton would consent to such a government. Additionally, there is archaeological evidence to show that there was limited intermarriage between the Anglo-Saxons and Britons. And if we use some other kind of contemporary areas where there are invading populations at this time period, like Visigothic Spain and Norman England later in history, we show that when marriage did happen, it was largely restricted to an invading male and a native female, which is consistent with genetic evidence, because it's the Y chromosome, right? So the male genes are more prevalent. So this kind of classification and these imbalances in the genetics perhaps points to the idea that an elite was established in England which was consciously and ethnically Anglo-Saxon, which is consistent with a military conquest rather than some kind of, just mass migration and settlement that was for some reason consented to. Sexual apartheid would more likely have happened in a soft sense rather than via deliberate enforcement, as its name suggests. And perhaps this is more kind of what they wanted to end up suggesting, but they were just trying trying to be a bit controversial to get more eyes on their study, as it's sort of a smart move to do, I suppose. It is reasonable to assume that the class difference illustrated by this Ware Guild law would be reflected by a difference in material wealth between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons, which in this period allows for bigger families. This is especially true as the Anglo-Saxons within this period were pagan, and so were not restricted to monogamy. Some archaeological studies of burial sites in this period have shown that males buried with weapons are taller than those buried without, which could be due to environmental factors resulting from higher class, such as diet and health in youthful years. It's reasonable to assume that because of the higher class suggested by the Ware Guild numbers, a larger proportion of these weapon-owning men were Anglo-Saxon, as weapons were a status symbol in this period, and burial with an expensive item such as a weapon implies even more wealth than if you possessed one in life. This considered, higher class Anglo-Saxons would have benefited from superior health and taller builds on average, which combined with their additional wealth would create positive sex selection in the population. Easier selection of partners plus a larger potential family size combined could have created a situation where Anglo-Saxon males had a larger share of reproductive partners for a prolonged period of many generations, which created the Y chromosome replacement without a mass extermination happening of Brythonic males. This also would not require a formalised apartheid social structure, which Thomas, Stumpf and Hark seemed to argue for, although, like I said, I think they might have just been a little bit wacky in the headline, just so that they'd get more views on their study. Instead, a scenario of military conquest, where a largely male conquering group take up the role of the previous elite males in the patriarchy, even the lowest ranking of which would likely be enriched to some extent by plunder or reward for the conquest, elevating their status and allowing them to reproduce more. Such an occurrence would trend the migrant males towards a privileged reproductive position, explaining the Y chromosome prevalence via apartheid in a soft sense. So basically, you don't need to have specific breeding laws. If the Anglo-Saxons come across and they win a few battles, they become the elite. They're pagan, they're not even monogamous, so they get like 4 Brythonic Celtic hoes and have a shit ton of kids in a small sort of space of time. That could quickly explain this Y chromosome prevalence, and it could also explain over time why they managed to redefine particularly England. They became an integral part of the genetic stock, and coming with that, you can imagine how much that would spread their culture and their worldview. It has been demonstrated that a numerical advantage is not a necessity for this phenomenon of 50 to 100% Y chromosome hegemony in England. In the work of Thomas, Stumpf and Hark, they demonstrate that with a computer simulation that a migrant ethnic group which is reproductively advantaged could rise from 10% Y chromosome share to 50% Y chromosome share within as little as 5 generations, if they're reproductively advantaged enough. This is backed up by another genetic study which suggests that today's ethnically British population is around 25 to 40% Anglo-Saxon DNA in total, which shows you that the Y chromosome prevalence is a lot more than the general genetic prevalence. So it's a result of male Anglo-Saxon overrepresentation rather than an even replacement of the previous people's genes. This simulation casts doubt on the idea that mass immigration was required, as well as replacement via extermination being required. We see from the tribal hidage, which was likely produced in the 670s during the reign of King Wulfhere of Mercia, who was a Bretwalder, which means that he claims to rule Britain, but it really means that he was the strongest king in Britain, basically. It's a sort of ordering a list of all of the tribal groups that exist in Britain, and so this includes the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, at this time, but it also describes the different tribal groups of the Britons that still exist in sort of the west of England and, other places where they still are kind of hanging on. And it also shows the amount of area that their territory is. And the unit of measurement is hides, which I guess is the idea that you would lay hides down to measure the area. But yeah, many tribal groups existed among the Britons, is what this shows. And some had territory comprising only 300 hides, which is tiny compared to the Kingdom of Wessex or whatever, for example. This remarkable lack of unification, even when the Anglo-Saxons have got a massive foothold in the country at this point, this would certainly have reduced the bloodshed required for the Anglo-Saxons to settle in Britain, wouldn't it? If there was no unified resistance to them as invading heathen infidels, as Gildas kind of paints it, or a particularly foreign and strange ethnic group, which you would get the impression of by reading Gildas. In The Ruin of Britain he writes, "External wars may have stopped, but not civil ones." And this is referring to a time when the Anglo-Saxons had conquered land, but so it was high time for the Brythonic peoples to unite together and fight against them. But they continued to fight amongst themselves. So they're clearly not like a unified people. In sub-Roman Britain, fractured in this way, the Anglo-Saxon warrior elites of militarily successful war bands could have replaced the rulers of a splintered area without conflicts escalating to the point where they had to take on the whole of England. All these different Brythonic tribal groups sort of uniting together and fighting in a coalition against them. This doesn't seem like this is what happened if they haven't unified by the time in 670, when there's already, an Anglo-Saxon king of Mercia, for example, and several other regions. And this is backed up by what Gildas writes about civil wars, in inverted commas, happening. We can infer from this that they are not as unified as he would assume by describing them as Britons as one group, Now, this idea that a war band could arrive and take out one small region in a sort of modular way is still more plausible by the small size of military forces in this period and this area. For instance, the total mustering strength of Dalriada is estimated as 1,500 soldiers. The fractured tribes of the Britons would probably muster really small armies, making them vulnerable to raiding and surprise attack from amphibious warbands. When compared to the rapid collapse of similar sub-Roman period territories of Gaul and Iberia into two invasions in the 5th century, the Anglo-Saxon conquest of British lands was slow, which would also suggest small numbers of invaders. This makes sense, as they came from different locations and had to travel by sea. And by different locations, I mean the Anglo-Saxons, as you may know, refers to several different groups, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, etc., which come from different parts of Northern Europe. So yes, not a large migration because it has to happen by sea, but the fact that the armies they could muster were so small and it was fractured means that it was possible to take out these small kingdoms, even if you had small war bands coming over in small ships. A stark ethnic divide, which Gildas would imply by his dehumanization of the Anglo-Saxons. A stark ethnic divide between these Anglo-Saxons and the Britons seems rather unlikely. Despite how key this genetic science that I'm referencing is for us to understand this period, and for us to get past the literarily dark nature of it, it's important to remember that although we can tell these genes apart to some extent, the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons were not binarily different ethnically, as it might seem when we're looking at statistics like, I can tell you about the percentage of the Y chromosome that these scientists have worked out, but, that would perhaps give you the impression that they were completely different, but they weren't. They're both groups from Northern Europe, and they both have a common ancestor population, which is referred to by academics as the Beaker people, who spread to the British Isles from mainland Europe, and are estimated to have replaced over 90% of Britain's Neolithic gene pool by the Middle Bronze Age. So that is, pretty solidly the ethnic group of these Brythonic people. Additionally, there had already been a Germanic presence in Roman Britain, including legions recruited from Germanic peoples outside the empire, which is a lot of the Roman army in the later periods of the Roman Empire, Germanic peoples. Aside from looking the same and having previous contact, as I've just described, the Germanic pantheon was very similar to the pre-Christian Celtic counterpart in the British Isles, and considering the fact that Britain would later have to be reconverted to Christianity once again, it's likely that this religion had some appeal with the locals, even though, as you would guess from the writings of Gildas, it's technically Christian. Alongside the general demographic impact of the plague of Justinian on the Romano-British, there's another notable demographic shift which ties to the genetic evidence, this Y-chromosome situation that I talked about earlier. There were several exoduses of troops from Britain during the later period of Roman Britain. There were several sort of revolutions and upstart people that tried to break off the northwest of the empire from the rest. So as a result, General Stilicho, Magnus Maximus, and finally Constantine III all pulled at least part of Britain's designated garrison out for wars on the continent. Gildas describes the departure of usurper Maximus to fight a civil war against Theodosius I as a catastrophe for the Britons.
Britain was despoiled of her whole army, her military resources, and her sturdy youth.
If the other withdrawals had similar effects, which, hard to assume that it wouldn't have a similar effect, because these people have to leave, and not all of them are going to come back, it must be true that the warrior demographic, young males who can fight, this warrior demographic within sub-Roman Britain was thinned several times, weakening Brythonic society and lowering the level of military resistance that it could offer. This is especially true when coupled with the collapse of Roman administration mentioned earlier. We know that the Roman army left. That's always the key moment that's reported, that they pulled the legions out. And we know that a lot of high-up elites would have left because they would have known that, everything's about to go south. Perhaps some British people left. The more likely people that left would have been people who are able-bodied, etc., etc. People who are more wealthy, perhaps more likely to be the kind of person that would help to resist invasion, etc., etc. So it's reasonable to assume that that would have also had a sort of debilitating effect on this area. So you probably got the idea of my argument by now, but I'll go through my summary part just so that you sort of get a nice round off. Basically, although violence was a necessity for these Anglo-Saxon elites to establish themselves as the lawmakers of a swathe of Britain, which we know that they for sure did, a surprisingly small amount of bloodshed was actually required to settle the land. Lacking archaeological evidence for mass killings, and with necessary migration levels for a kind of completely numbers-driven demographic replacement, with that lacking, and with that completely implausible, really, the recent genetic research, which seems at first to kind of point towards the bloodiest of outcomes, if we weren't considering the sort of potential of what's able to happen over time, is in fact more likely the result of a long process of breeding patterns between the two groups. The settling group of Anglo-Saxons was disproportionately male, and when successful would be disproportionately higher status, which is consistent with the genetic findings. Despite the element of military conquest, bloodshed was limited to a small scale because the armies that these states could field were small, and the Anglo-Saxons and Britons were both split into tribal groups. The groups which we collectively refer to as Anglo-Saxons benefited from a recent history which did not include being conquered by the flipping Roman Empire, which took up the responsibility of administration and military organisation for them. And so these muscles if I can use a little kind of analogy, these muscles had not atrophied in the same way that it would in sub-Roman Britain. They had an unbroken warrior tradition, which may not have been quite as good as Rome's one, but it was theirs, and they could, they were continuing to replicate it because they were always in control of it. And this gave them an edge against the Britons. In addition, as mentioned earlier, the Germanic lands were not hit to the same extent by the plague of Justinian, which would weaken the Brythonic tribes. These edges allowed an Anglo-Saxon warrior elite to triumph militarily over time against the Brythonic equivalent, but not in the epic way that Gildas describes, where there's like complete genocide, and it's like a clash between God and pagans and yada yada. In fact, it was in a context where both peoples were divided into tribal groups, and likely very small military forces were used, with most people uninvolved directly. So many peasants need to be working the land in order for an army to be running around doing things. The Anglo-Saxon settlement was bloody, but it was bloody on a small scale. So that's sort of my take on it. I hope you get the sort of general impression there. And I thought I'd put this out because it's quite interesting, in my opinion, how demographic shifts can happen. There's kind of the genetics element is quite interesting. But I think I've covered everything there. That conclusion was better than I remember it being. So there we go. Like and subscribe. I've got more lore coming out. I'll do more history in the future. I'm working up to doing the Opium Wars thing, but it's going to take me a long time to record and everything, so I'm sort of trying to make sure that I'm definitely back in the groove before I do it, so that it does it justice. Alright, thank you very much, like and subscribe.